They didn't erase us because we were weak. They erased us because we survived.
Before you start arguing about who counts as indigenous, hush and give me 11 seconds. Black indigenous Americans are real. They have always been real, and the United States government spent over 150 years trying to erase them from tribal roles so they wouldn't have to share land, oil money, or sovereignty. The Black Seminoles fought 3 wars against the U.S. Army between 1816 and 1858 in Florida and never surrendered. The Cherokee Freedmen were forcibly enrolled as tribal citizens by the Treaty of 1866 after the Civil War and then stripped of their rights in 2007 before being legally restored in 2017. John Horse, a Black Seminole leader born around 1812, led his people from Florida to Mexico in 1850 to escape American re-enslavement, and his descendants still live in Coahuila, Mexico, and Brackettville, Texas. Today, stay with me, because the bloodlines are documented, the treaties are signed, and the erasure has names attached to it. Start with the Black Seminoles because their story breaks the entire myth. In the 1700s, enslaved Africans escaping plantations in Georgia and the Carolinas ran south into Spanish Florida. The Spanish offered them freedom in exchange for converting to Catholicism and helping defend the colony. They built free Black towns. They farmed. They raised families. They allied with the Seminole people, themselves a confederation of Creek refugees and other indigenous groups who had moved into Florida. The Africans and the Seminoles intermarried. They fought side by side. They shared food, language, and land. By the early 1800s, there were Black Seminole towns like Pilaclicaja and Angola, where free Black people lived under Seminole protection with their own leaders, their own warriors, and their own councils. They weren't slaves of the Seminoles, as American propaganda later claimed to justify recapturing them. They were allies, citizens, and family. Then, the United States showed up with chains. Andrew Jackson invaded Florida in 1818 in what became known as the First Seminole War, and the unspoken reason was to destroy the free Black communities that were inspiring enslaved people across the South to run. Spain ceded Florida to the U.S. in 1819. The Second Seminole War from 1835 to 1842 was the longest and most expensive war the United States fought against an indigenous people up to that point. It cost over $40 million in 1840s money and the lives of around 1,500 American soldiers. The general in charge, Thomas Jesup, said it himself in 1836, "This is a Negro war, not an Indian war." He understood that the backbone of the Seminole resistance was Black warriors fighting for their freedom. Men like John Horse, also called Juan Caballo, led raids, negotiated treaties, and outsmarted American generals for years. The U.S. eventually forced most Seminoles west to Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma, on a death march of their own that ran parallel to the Cherokee Trail of Tears. Black Seminoles went with them. Same trail, same hunger, same dying babies in the cold. In Oklahoma, the Black Seminoles found out the betrayal wasn't over. Creek slaveholders started raiding Black Seminole settlements to capture them and sell them back into slavery, claiming They were runaway property, even though many had been free for generations. The U.S. government refused to protect them. So in 1850, John Horse led a group of around 300 black Seminoles and Seminoles loyal to Chief Wildcat across Texas and into Mexico, where slavery was illegal. The Mexican government granted them land in Coahuila in exchange for serving as border guards against Apache and Comanche raids. They were called the Mascogos. Their descendants are still there. In the 1870s, the U.S. Army recruited some black Seminoles back across the border to serve as Seminole Negro Indian Scouts working out of Fort Clark in Texas. 4 of them earned the Medal of Honor: John Ward, Pompey Factor, Isaac Payne, and Adam Payne. Their graves are in the Seminole Indian Scout Cemetery in Brackettville, Texas, and their descendants gather there every September for Seminole Days. Real people, real graves, real bloodline. Now turn to the Cherokee Freedmen, because this is where the receipts get heavy with paperwork. The Cherokee Nation, like the other so-called 5 civilized tribes, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, owned enslaved Africans before and during the Civil War. Some wealthy Cherokee families had plantations and held black people in bondage just like white slaveholders did. When the Cherokee Nation sided with the Confederacy in 1861, they sealed their own fate. After the war, the United States forced the Cherokee Nation to sign the Treaty of 1866, which abolished slavery in the nation and granted full Cherokee citizenship to the freed black people who had been enslaved by the Cherokee, along with their descendants. The treaty was explicit. Freedmen and their descendants would have all the rights of native Cherokees: voting, land, annuities, tribal membership. Forever, that treaty got violated again and again for over a century. In 1983, the Cherokee Nation passed a rule requiring tribal citizens to have a direct ancestor on the Dawes Rolls, the federal Indian census taken between 1898 and 1914. The Dawes Rolls were segregated. People with any visible African ancestry got listed on a separate freedman roll, regardless of whether they also had Cherokee blood. So a person who was half Cherokee and half black ended up on the freedman roll instead of the Cherokee by blood roll. By requiring ancestry from the by blood roll, the 1983 rule effectively cut freedmen descendants out of citizenship, even though many of them carried Cherokee DNA in their veins. In 2007, the Cherokee Nation held a referendum and amended their constitution to require Cherokee blood ancestry, explicitly stripping the freedmen of citizenship. Marilyn Vann, a Cherokee Freedman descendant and engineer from Oklahoma, led the legal fight. After 10 years of court battles, a federal judge ruled in 2017 that the Treaty of 1866 was still binding and that Cherokee freedmen had to be reinstated as citizens with full rights. They won, but the fight is still going on for freedmen of the Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations, where the U.S. government has been slower to enforce the same treaty obligations. Let the human cost sit on you for a moment. Imagine being a black grandmother in Oklahoma whose great-great-grandmother walked the Trail of Tears alongside her Cherokee owners turned tribal family. You grew up speaking some Cherokee. You know the medicine. You know the songs. You go to the stomp dances. Your family has been part of that nation since before Oklahoma was a state. Then in 2007, the tribal council votes that you and your children are no longer Cherokee citizens because your skin tells a story they don't want to claim. You lose your health care. You lose your voting rights in tribal elections. You lose the right to be buried in tribal cemeteries. Your identity, lived for 6 generations, gets stamped invalid by a paperwork rule designed to exclude you. That's not ancient history. That happened to real people in our lifetime. Marilyn Van is still alive. She still has the legal documents. The wound is still fresh. Now go wider, because Black indigenous identity stretches across every region of this country, and almost every Native nation has Black members somewhere in its history. The Lumbee of North Carolina, the Pamunkey of Virginia, the Mashpee Wampanoag of Massachusetts, the Shinnecock of Long Island, the Powhatan Renap of New Jersey, the Houma of Louisiana, the Creek and Choctaw of the Southeast, the Narragansett of Rhode Island, the Pequot of Connecticut. All of these nations have substantial numbers of citizens with mixed African and indigenous ancestry going back hundreds of years. Enslaved Africans escaped into Native communities. Free Black people married into Native families. Indigenous people captured during colonial wars were sold into slavery and bore children with enslaved Africans on plantations across the Caribbean and the American South. The result is millions of Black Americans walking around right now with real, traceable indigenous ancestry, and millions of indigenous Americans walking around with real, traceable African ancestry. Same family, same wound, same blood. The legal system tried to make this impossible to prove. Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act in 1924, which mandated that every person be classified as either white or colored. And a man named Walter Plecker, the head of the Virginia Bureau of Vital Statistics, spent decades systematically reclassifying Native Virginians as colored on birth certificates, marriage records, and death certificates. He wrote letters to government officials across the state instructing them to refuse to record anyone as Indian. He said Indians in Virginia were really mixed-race Black people pretending to be Native to escape segregation. He didn't just lie, he destroyed records. He told midwives what to write. He erased entire tribal identities with the stroke of a bureaucratic pen. The Monacan, Pamunkey, and other Virginia tribes didn't get federal recognition until 2015 and 2018, partly because Plecker's paper genocide had wiped out the documentation they needed to prove continuous tribal existence. That's how powerful the erasure was. Real people with real indigenous ancestry got legally turned into something else by a single racist clerk who lived from 1861 to 1947 and outlasted most of his victims. Talk about Plecker's twin in the South, blood quantum. The U.S. government developed the concept of blood quantum, the measurement of indigenous ancestry by fractions, specifically to shrink Native nations out of existence over generations. If you require someone to be at least 1/4 or 1/2 Native by blood to count as a tribal member, then within a few generations of mixed marriages, the roles shrink, land claims weaken, sovereignty erodes, federal recognition disappears. Blood quantum was a weapon, and it cut Black indigenous people the deepest because their African ancestry got used to disqualify them from their indigenous identity even when their cultural connection was unbroken. Some nations still use blood quantum today. Others, like the Cherokee, abandoned it in favor of lineal descent from the Dawes rolls, which created its own racist exclusions. Either way, the math was rigged to make native people disappear on paper while their actual descendants kept living their lives, raising kids, dancing at powwows, and being told they weren't real. Look at the black Indians of the Mississippi Delta and Louisiana, because the cultural fingerprints are everywhere if you know where to look. The Mardi Gras Indians of New Orleans, those elaborate suits with the feathers and beadwork that take a year to make, come from a tradition that started in the 1800s when black New Orleanians honored the indigenous people who had sheltered escaped enslaved Africans in the swamps. The tribes have names like the Wild Magnolias, the Wild Trouppatulas, the Yellow Pocahontas. The chants and rituals blend West African and indigenous Louisiana traditions because the people who created them came from both worlds. That's not costume play. That's living memory of an alliance that saved lives. Look at the Gullah Geechee of the South Carolina and Georgia coast. Their ancestors include enslaved Africans who escaped and intermarried with the Yamasee and other coastal indigenous nations before disease and war shrank those nations to nothing. Look at the Maroons of Florida and the Great Dismal Swamp on the North Carolina-Virginia border, where free black and indigenous communities lived together for over a century, hidden from the slave catchers, raising children who were both at once and neither halfway. Look at the black settlers who built towns alongside the 5 tribes in Oklahoma after the Trail of Tears. Boley, Oklahoma, Langston, Taft, black towns founded on Indian territory by people who were both black and indigenous and didn't see a contradiction. Now feel the rage point at the right target, because this is where it has to land. The erasure of black indigenous Americans wasn't an accident. It served 3 different power structures at the same time. White America wanted to keep racial categories rigid so the one-drop rule could keep maximum bodies in the black labor pool. The U.S. government wanted to shrink native nations to seize their land and end treaty obligations. And some tribal governments, influenced by anti-black racism imported from white American culture, wanted to limit who could share in tribal resources like gaming revenue and federal funds. 3 different systems with 3 different motives all benefited from pretending black indigenous people didn't exist. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's bureaucratic policy with signatures and dates on it. Take it personal, because most of you watching have a piece of this in your own family. The story your great-grandmother told about a Cherokee or Blackfoot or Choctaw ancestor wasn't always a myth. Some of those stories were real. Some were exaggerated. Some were genuine memory of an ancestor whose tribal connection got severed by Plecker, by Dawes, by blood quantum, by a courthouse fire, by a grandmother who stopped talking about it because the family didn't want trouble. The way to tell the difference isn't a DNA test from a corporate lab, because those tests use reference populations that often can't distinguish North American indigenous ancestry from other populations reliably. The way to tell the difference is paper records, oral history, and tribal community. If your family has a real indigenous ancestor, the paperwork usually exists and census records, allotment files, freedmen rolls, court cases, or church records. You can find them. Genealogists who specialize in Black indigenous research are doing this work right now and reuniting families with histories that the state tried to bury. Sit with the present moment because the fight isn't over. The Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations are still resisting full reinstatement of their freedmen descendants despite the same treaty of 1866 language. Federal courts and the Department of the Interior have begun pressuring those nations to comply, but the cases are dragging through the system year after year, while elders die without getting their citizenship back. State-recognized tribes across the Southeast are fighting for federal recognition while having to defend themselves against accusations that their Black-presenting members aren't really Native. Black indigenous activists are organizing, publishing, filing lawsuits, and showing up to tribal council meetings demanding their place. This is a living movement. Marilyn Van is still organizing. The descendants of freedmen of the 5 Civilized Tribes Association is still active. The Black Seminole communities in Mexico and Texas are still preserving their language, their music, and their history. These aren't reenactors. These are nations within nations who refuse to disappear. Bring it home where it has to live. If you grew up hearing that your family had Native blood and you laughed it off because everybody said that, look again. If you have ancestors who came out of Oklahoma, Florida, Louisiana, Virginia, the Carolinas, or the Gulf Coast, the odds of a real connection go up. If you have a great-grandparent whose race kept shifting on different census records, that's a clue. If your family was Gullah, Geechee, Creole, or Cajun, that's a clue. Pull the records. Ask the elders before they pass. Sit with cousins you haven't seen in a decade and write down what they remember. Your history is bigger than the box the country put you in. The country knew that. The country built that box specifically to keep you from knowing it. Tell the kids, show them pictures of John Horse and Marilyn Van and the Mardi Gras Indian chiefs in their feathered crowns. Show them photos of the Seminole Negro Indian scouts in their cavalry uniforms with Medal of Honor ribbons. Show them maps of Black Seminole settlements in Florida and Mexico. Show them the Treaty of 1866 with the signatures on it. Let them see that Black and Indigenous aren't separate aisles in a history textbook. They're the same family album with pages somebody tried to tear out and couldn't quite finish the job on. Drop a comment and tell me what your family said about indigenous ancestry growing up. Tell me if you know about a Black town in Oklahoma or a maroon community in your state. Tell me if you're descended from a Cherokee Freedman, a Choctaw Freedman, a Creek Freedman, a Black Seminole, or a Mardi Gras Indian. Tell me if you're Gullah Geechee or Lumbee or Houma. Tag a cousin who needs to read this and tell me which nation you want me to break down next. The Black Cherokee Freedmen fight in detail. The Black Seminoles of Mexico, the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp, the Mardi Gras Indians, and their West African roots. Pick one, and I'll bring the receipts the same way.